The water below was the color of a day-old bruise. "Commander Jackson." "Jax." Reed stood in the open bay door of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter, letting the brutal, sub-zero wind bite into the exposed skin around his tactical goggles. 200 miles off the Norwegian coast, the North Atlantic didn't just feel cold, it felt malicious. Down there, the iron-gray swells rolled and crashed against massive, grinding plates of ice like tectonic shelves at war. It was the kind of environment that didn't just kill a person, it erased them. Jax, a seasoned Navy SEAL team leader with multiple tours from the Korengal Valley to the Horn of Africa, respected this ocean. He knew that water temperature down there was sitting at a lethal 29 degrees Fahrenheit. "Bank left. 15 degrees, Jax said into his headset, his voice stripped of all inflection. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Voss, the pilot who had flown with Jax for the better part of a decade, didn't ask why. He just banked the helo. When Jax used that flat, deadpan tone, it meant the operational baseline had shifted. Something was wrong. "Talk to me, Commander," Voss said over the comms, fighting the stick against a sudden, violent updraft. "Grid Sector 49er. I've got debris," Jax replied, adjusting his binoculars. They were responding to a distress ping that had gone dark exactly 72 hours ago. The registry belonged to a privately chartered research vessel out of Tromsø. But the intel didn't add up. The debris field scattered below them, jagged shards of fiberglass, an uninflated life raft, and scorched hull plating, spoke of catastrophic, sudden failure, explosives, not weather. And then, Jax saw it. Drifting 200 feet below them, bobbing mercilessly on a broken slab of wooden decking, was a shape, face down, half submerged. "I've got a body," said Petty Officer First Class Grant Holloway, the team's rescue swimmer, leaning out from the hoist station. Holloway was a professional. He never said the word corpse until a medical officer called the time of death. But the unspoken truth hung heavy in the freezing air. 72 hours in this water. It was a recovery mission now, not a rescue. "Take us down. Get a downwash reading," Jax ordered. "Surface temp is -1 Celsius. Commander, wind chill puts it well below that," Voss replied, the helo descending into the furious roar of the ocean. Holloway hooked his carabiner into the winch. He didn't hesitate. "You didn't leave anyone behind in this water. Breathing or not." The rotor wash from the Sierra blasted the surface of the ocean into a chaotic storm of white noise and freezing spray as Holloway rappelled down the steel cable. From the cabin, Jax watched through the optics. He watched Holloway's boots hit the unstable, pitching debris. He watched the swimmer fight for balance, drop to one knee, and reach out to secure the prone, ice-covered figure. And then, Jax saw something that made the blood freeze in his veins faster than the Arctic wind. Before Holloway's gloved hand could even touch the victim's shoulder, the figure moved. It wasn't the chaotic, thrashing panic of a drowning victim. It wasn't the involuntary spasm of severe hypothermia. It was a fluid, calculated, and terrifyingly precise martial sweep. The victim's left arm snapped upward like a coiled spring, catching Holloway's wrist in a vice-like grip, locking his arm out, and neutralizing him in a fraction of a second. "Whoa, hey," Holloway's voice cracked over the radio, a mix of shock and pure adrenaline. The victim rolled over. Through the binoculars, Jax saw her face. Her skin was the color of old parchment. Her lips tinged a dangerous, necrotic blue. Ice crystals were frozen solidly into her dark, matted hair, but her eyes, pale, piercing, and terrifyingly lucid, snapped open and locked onto Holloway. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Scanning, evaluating, threat or rescue? She released his wrist. "Commander." Holloway breathed heavily into the mic, his voice trembling, not from the cold, but from what he was looking at. "She's alive, she's awake, and, Commander, she's armed." "Say again, Holloway?" Jax leaned out, squinting through the sea spray. "Did you say armed?" "Affirmative, both hands, full grip. She won't let it go." Jax zoomed the optics in, wrapped tightly against her chest, shielded from the corrosive saltwater by the curve of her own dying body. Was a rifle, But it wasn't a standard hunting piece or an assault carbine. Even covered in ice, Jax recognized the massive, imposing silhouette. It was a Chaytak M200 intervention. But it was heavily modified. The barrel was a fluted, matte black monstrosity, chambered for .408, a sniper's dream. A weapon designed to reach out and touch a target across completely different zip codes. Hook her up. Get her in the bird. Right now, Jax barked, his combat instincts fully overriding the shock. The extraction took 4 agonizing minutes. Every time the winch swung in the violent winds, threatening to smash them against the helo's landing gear, the woman didn't brace herself with her hands. Instead, she adjusted her body weight, taking the brunt of the impacts against her own ribs and shoulders, keeping the sniper rifle completely clear of the slamming steel. It was pure, unfiltered muscle memory. The weapon was her lifeline, her own body was secondary. When Holloway finally hauled her onto the aluminum deck of the fuselage, she collapsed, the last reserve of adrenaline that had kept her conscious burned out. And her eyes rolled back. "I need a medkit. Blankets. Now," yelled Tyler Marsh, the youngest corpsman on the team. He dropped to his knees, ripping open thermal foil blankets. Jax stepped over to the woman as Marsh began his frantic triage. "Core temp?" Jax asked. Marsh pressed a temporal scanner to her forehead, frowning as he read the digital display. He checked her pulse, pressing 2 fingers against her icy neck. He looked up at his commander, his young face pale. "Heart rate is 48 beats per minute. Commander," Marsh said, his voice dropping to a whisper. 48? Jax frowned. "That's impossible. After 3 days in the Atlantic, her heart should be fibrillating at 140, trying to keep her organs from shutting down." "I know, sir. She's cold, but she's not shivering. Her body isn't fighting the cold. It's like she commanded her nervous system to just hibernate. To slow down." Jax looked down at her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, up close. The scars of a hard life were visible, faint, precise white lines on her jaw and knuckles. But what held his attention was her right hand. Even unconscious, deep in a coma-like state, her hand was fused to the grip of the Chaytak. But it wasn't a death grip of panic. Her thumb was rested deliberately outside the trigger guard. Her index finger was indexed perfectly straight along the lower receiver. It was textbook, flawless trigger discipline. Holloway unclipped his helmet and knelt beside Jax. The rescue swimmer looked deeply unsettled. "Commander," Holloway murmured, making sure the comms were off. "I've pulled 100 souls out of the water. Fishermen, downed pilots, civilians. That right there?" He pointed to her frozen, indexed finger. "She's not a civilian." "No," Jax said quietly, his eyes drifting down to the heavy, custom-machined buttstock of the rifle. Embedded seamlessly into the carbon fiber was a small, black rectangular module, a data logger, a black box. "She's a ghost." Jax reached down, intending to gently pry the massive weapon from her frozen fingers so the medics could work. But as his glove brushed the cold steel of the barrel, he stopped. He remembered the blinding speed with which she had locked out Holloway's arm. He remembered those pale eyes. "Why do you still have it?" Jax thought, staring at her slack face. 3 days in the freezing abyss, staring death in the eyes, and you never let it go. What is in this rifle that is worth more than your own life? "Commander," Voss called from the cockpit, breaking Jax's trance. "Reykjavik base is tracking us. We're 30 mics out. Do I call ahead for an ambulance?" Jax stood up, the deck vibrating beneath his boots. He looked at the custom weapon. No serial numbers, no manufacturer stamps. A ghost weapon for a ghost operative. If he handed her over to the standard military brass, she would disappear forever into a black site. Whoever had blown up her ship and left her for dead had long, powerful arms. "No ambulance, Voss," Jax said, his voice returning to that flat, unyielding tone. "Call ahead to the Naval Annex. Secure the private armory and lockdown Medical Bay 4. Under my personal clearance code." "Copy that. Lockdown protocols." Jax looked back down at the woman. Cassidy, Ghost, Miller. Though he didn't know her name yet. He only knew one thing for certain as the helicopter banked hard through the snowstorm. leaving the graveyard of the North Atlantic behind. She hadn't just survived the ocean. She was waiting for the ice to melt so she could finish whatever war she had started. The fluorescent lights of the Reykjavik Naval Annex basement hummed with a low, anemic buzz. Down here, deep inside the secure bunker level, there were no windows to show the raging Icelandic blizzard outside. There was only concrete, steel, and the heavy smell of gun oil and ozone. Commander Jackson, Jax, Reed stood in the center of the base's classified armory. His arms crossed over his chest. Resting on the stainless steel examination table under a harsh halogen work light was the weapon they had pulled from the freezing Atlantic. It looked less like a firearm and more like an instrument of surgical violence. Standing over it was Gunner's Mate Chief, Sully Sullivan. Before joining the Navy, Sully had spent 5 years working R&D for a private defense contractor whose name was redacted on every piece of paper Jax had ever seen. If a weapon could throw a piece of lead downrange, Sully knew its soul. But right now, Sully wasn't speaking. He had been staring at the rifle in absolute silence for 10 straight minutes. "Talk to me, Sully," Jax finally said, the quiet of the room starting to grind on his nerves. Sully snapped a fresh pair of black nitrile examination gloves over his wrists. He reached out with the careful, almost reverent hesitation of a man disarming a bomb, and ran his fingertips along the cold, matte black chassis. "I've seen a lot of custom builds, Commander," Sully murmured, his voice thick with a Boston accent he'd never quite lost. "But this isn't factory. This isn't even high-end aftermarket. This is bespoke. Someone with multi-million-dollar, 5-axis CNC machines built this entire receiver from scratch." "What's the platform?" Jax asked, stepping closer. "The architecture mimics a Chaitak M200 intervention. It's chambered in .408 Chaitak," Sully said, popping the massive bolt open. The action was so smooth it didn't even click, it just glided like glass on glass. "But the tolerances, Jesus, Jax, the tolerances on this bolt face are measured in the 10,000ths of an inch. There is zero play, none." Jax looked at the massive, fluted barrel. "It's heavy. 30-inch barrel, free-floated, threaded for a suppressor. But it's not here," Sully noted, producing a bore light and shining it down the muzzle. He whistled low. 1 in 8 twist rate. That's aggressive. Standard long-range platforms don't run a twist that tight. Someone tuned this specifically to stabilize a very heavy, solid copper-nickel projectile in sub-zero, high-density air. "What about the glass?" Jax pointed to the empty Picatinny rail on top of the receiver. "Gone," Sully said, running a thumb over the dovetail mount marks. "Removed cleanly. And recently. There's no saltwater corrosion in the mounting grooves." Before she went into the water, she dumped the optic, probably a Nightforce ATAC-R or a Schmidt and Bender. Something heavy. She knew the glass would get compromised in the ocean. Or she didn't want anyone pulling the zero data off the turrets. Jax thought about the woman lying in Medical Bay 4, her body temperature slowly climbing from the edge of death. She knew she was going into the water. She prepped the weapon for survival. Sully rotated the rifle on its bipod, exposing the underside of the massive carbon fiber stock, right forward of the pistol grip. Seamlessly integrated into the chassis was a small, black rectangular module. It had no buttons, only a single, non-standard micro data port. "There it is," Jax said softly, "the black box." Sully leaned in, pulling a jeweler's loop over his right eye. "I've heard rumors of these in the DARPA circles. Ballistic data loggers. They record everything the moment the firing pin drops. Atmospheric pressure, ambient temperature, humidity, wind shear at the muzzle, and GPS coordinates." Sully looked up, meeting Jax's eyes. "Commander, do you know what MOA is?" "Minute of angle," Jax replied, dipping into his sniper cross-training. "A unit of angular measurement used to adjust sights." "Exactly," Sully said, stepping back and wiping his hands on a rag. Shifting into professor mode, 1 MOA is roughly 1 inch at 100 yards. If you're shooting at a target 1,000 yards away, a 1 MOA adjustment moves your bullet impact by 10 inches. It's basic geometry. But here's the thing, Jax. Sully pointed a gloved finger at the dark. Menacing barrel of the Wraith 408. A standard military sniper taking a shot at 1,500 yards has to account for bullet drop, windage, and maybe the spin drift of the bullet. But a gun built with these tolerances, firing a .408 Chaitak that stays supersonic past 2,000 yards? Whoever pulls this trigger isn't just dealing with wind. They have to calculate the Coriolis effect, the actual rotation of the Earth turning beneath the bullet while it's in flight. They have to account for the aerodynamic jump. This weapon wasn't built for combat, Commander. It was built for mathematics. Lethal, uncompromising mathematics. Jax felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Can you get into that module? The port is proprietary, Sully grunted, already turning toward his soldering station and pulling out a mess of copper wire and circuit boards. I have to build a custom adapter to bridge it to an air-gapped laptop. Give me 90 minutes. But Jax, if there's a data logger on this thing, it's encrypted, hard. Break it, Jax said. Whatever she was doing out there. Someone blew a $4 million research vessel to Kingdom Come just to stop it. I need to know why. Leaving Sully to his frantic engineering, Jax swiped his keycard and exited the armory. He walked down the concrete corridor to Medical Bay 4. Through the thick, reinforced observation glass, he watched Dr. Sarah Evans standing over the hospital bed. The woman, Cassidy, was still unconscious, hooked up to a lattice of IV tubes and thermal monitors. Jax pressed the intercom button. Status, Doc? Dr. Evans looked up, her expression a mix of sheer medical exhaustion and profound bewilderment. Commander, you need to see this chart. Because if I didn't run the blood panels myself, I'd say the machines were broken. Jax pushed through the heavy door, stepping into the sterile warmth of the med bay. Talk. She was in that water for 3 days, Evans said, tapping her tablet. Severe dehydration. Caloric burn is off the charts. But her core temperature stabilized at 92 degrees Fahrenheit and just stopped dropping. Under normal circumstances, a body fighting hypothermia shivers violently to generate heat. When the shivering stops, the thermoregulatory system is crashing. Cardiac arrest follows. But she wasn't shivering when Holloway pulled her up, Jax recalled. Exactly, Evans said, her voice dropping to a tight whisper. Her body suppressed the shiver response. She intentionally slowed her own heart rate down to a crawl to conserve oxygen and energy. Jax, you can't just tough out the North Atlantic. You can't meditate your way through ice water. Then how is she alive? Structured intervention, Evans said grimly, looking down at Cassidy's pale, scarred face. Level tier cold water survival conditioning. We're talking years of sustained, agonizing exposure protocols starting from a very young age. I don't know who this girl is, Commander, or what kind of program put her through that hell. But she wasn't just trained. She was manufactured. A sharp ping from Jax's tactical radio shattered the quiet of the room. Commander, Sully's voice crackled through the earpiece. Tight and breathless. I'm in. Jax looked at Dr. Evans, gave a curt nod, and sprinted back down the hall. When he burst through the armory doors, Sully was staring at the glowing screen of the Panasonic Toughbook. The glow of the monitor reflected off the armorer's sweat-beaded forehead. You broke the encryption? Jax asked, coming around the table. Brute forced the first partition, Sully said, his fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. It's a ledger, Jax. A shot log. 17 confirmed engagements spanning the last 14 months. Sully clicked on the most recent file. A spreadsheet of raw telemetry data flooded the screen. Timestamp. GPS coordinates. Barometric pressure, 980 hectopascals. Ambient temp, -14 Celsius. Wind speed, 31 km per hour, gusting to 48. Look at this weather data, Sully whispered in disbelief. Wind shear like that. It makes any long-range shot statistically impossible. The bullet would get batted out of the air like a badminton shuttlecock. Scroll down, Jax ordered, his eyes locked on the screen. Find the distance. Sully hit the page down key. The screen flickered, landing on the final telemetry output. The hit confirmation marker glowed a solid, undeniable green. Next to it was the calculated distance from the muzzle to the target. Jax stared at the number. The breath left his lungs. The humming of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade away into absolute, ringing silence. Distance, 4,112 meters. That's, Sully choked on the words. Commander, the confirmed world record is 3,540 meters. By a Canadian JTF-2 sniper in Iraq. And it took him 3 shots to walk the round onto the target. Jax leaned closer to the screen, his eyes tracing the line of data. Look at the trigger data. Sully, look at the ejection port log. Sully checked the line. He swallowed hard. 1 round ejected. 1 shot. 4,112 meters. Over 2.5 miles. A single bullet. Flying through an Arctic storm for more than 7 seconds. Threading an invisible needle through the chaos of the atmosphere. Who was the target? Jax asked, his voice dangerously low. Sully tapped the keyboard, running a decryption key on the target dossier attached to the shot log. A photograph materialized on the screen, along with a name and a heavily redacted NATO intelligence profile. Target, Arthur Sterling. Status, neutralized. Jax recognized the name immediately. Everyone in the Black Ops community knew the name Arthur Sterling. He was a billionaire defense contractor. A shadow broker who funded off the book's wet work programs for the highest bidder. Sterling was untouchable. He lived inside fortresses, surrounded by elite private armies. She didn't just assassinate Arthur Sterling. Jax realized, looking back at the Wraith 408 resting on the table. The rifle no longer looked like a weapon. It looked like the gavel of a Supreme Court judge. She shot him from a distance where his security detail didn't even exist. At 4,000 meters, walls don't matter. Money doesn't matter. There is only physics. Suddenly, the heavy steel door to the armory hissed open. Jax and Sully spun around. Jax's hand instinctively dropping to the Sig Sauer on his hip. Standing in the doorway, barefoot on the freezing concrete, wearing oversized Navy-issue scrubs, was Cassidy Miller. She had pulled her own IV out. A tiny drop of blood stained the crook of her left arm. She stood perfectly straight, her pale blue eyes locked onto the Chaitak on the table. She didn't look at Jax. She didn't look at Sully. The record is 3,540 meters, Jax said to her, his hand slowly moving away from his sidearm. Cassidy finally shifted her gaze to the commander. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. Records, she said, devoid of ego, devoid of pride, exist to be recalculated. Cassidy stood in the doorway of the armory, the harsh fluorescent light casting long, hollow shadows across her cheeks. She was barefoot on the freezing concrete, wearing oversized Navy scrubs, yet she commanded the gravity of the room the moment she spoke. Jax didn't move his hand completely away from his sidearm. He was a SEAL. He trusted his instincts. And right now, his instincts were screaming that the most dangerous weapon in the room wasn't the Wraith 408 resting on the table. It was her. You shouldn't be out of bed, Jax said, his voice steady, keeping his posture relaxed to de-escalate the tension. My core temperature is 94.2 degrees, Cassidy replied, her voice an eerie, rhythmic monotone, not robotic, but deliberately stripped of emotion. My heart rate is climbing to 55. I am functional. Commander Reed. Sully, still standing over the laptop, looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He looked from the decrypted shot log on the screen, to the Chaitak on the table, and finally to the frail-looking woman in the doorway. You, Sully swallowed hard. You took a shot at 4,112 meters? In a Category 3 Arctic squall? Cassidy slowly walked into the room. She didn't look at the men. She walked straight to the table and rested her pale, scarred fingertips against the carbon fiber barrel of the rifle. The gesture was almost affectionate. Arthur Sterling's security detail was standard private military, Cassidy said softly, her eyes tracing the cold metal. 3 concentric rings, perimeter, interior, and close protection. They swept every ridgeline, every rooftop, every elevation point within a 2-mile radius. They built a fortress. She looked up, her pale blue eyes meeting Jax's. But they built it for conventional warfare. They didn't build it for me. Talk to me about the ballistics. Sully blurted out, unable to contain his inner armorer. A .408 solid copper monolithic round. Muzzle velocity of maybe 2,900 feet per second. At 4 kilometers. My God, the flight time alone. 7.4 seconds. Cassidy answered, without missing a beat. For 7.4 seconds. The bullet is in the air. A lot happens in 7 seconds. Chief Sullivan. Sully blinked. She had memorized his rank and name from the manifest she must have seen on the way down. At that distance, Cassidy continued, her voice turning into a chilling lecture. You aren't just fighting wind. You are fighting the atmosphere itself. As the bullet crosses the transonic barrier, dropping below the speed of sound, it destabilizes. It wobbles. You have to calculate the exact barometric pressure to ensure the bullet restabilizes before it hits the target. But that's the easy part. Jax crossed his arms. And the hard part? The Earth, she whispered, at 4,000 meters. The Coriolis effect, the actual rotation of the planet, moves the target while the bullet is in flight. Furthermore, you have spin drift. The rifling of the barrel spins the bullet to the right, which causes it to physically drift right over extreme distances. She looked at the laptop screen glowing in the dark armory. The bullet drop at that range is roughly 420 feet. Cassidy said, I didn't aim at Arthur Sterling. Commander, I aimed at a piece of empty sky, 400 feet above his head and 40 feet to his left. I fired, and I waited for the rotation of the Earth and the Arctic wind to carry him perfectly into the bullet's path. Silence fell over the armory. The only sound was the distant howling of the Icelandic blizzard outside the bunker walls. Jax had worked with the best snipers in naval special warfare. He had seen Mk-13s and Barrett .50 cals tear through engine blocks in Fallujah. But what she was describing wasn't marksmanship. It was localized, weaponized physics. How long were you in position? Jax asked quietly. 11 hours, she replied. In -14 degrees Celsius? Dr. Evans's voice suddenly echoed from the open doorway. The doctor had followed Cassidy down the hall, holding a medical tablet. Commander, lying prone on ice for 11 hours without thermal support. The human body simply cannot survive that. The blood pulls away from the extremities. Your fingers would lose the motor function required to pull a trigger. Cassidy turned her gaze to the doctor. You learn to manage the cold. Doctor, the pain is just data. You acknowledge the data, and you compartmentalize it. Jax stepped closer to the table, positioning himself between Cassidy and the rifle. Arthur Sterling funded private wars. He was a monster, yes, but he was heavily insulated by the CIA and half the Pentagon. You didn't just pull the trigger on a man. Cassidy, you pulled the trigger on a multi-billion-dollar shadow network. That's why they blew up your boat. Cassidy didn't flinch. I am aware. Who gave you the contract? Jax pressed, his voice hardening into the tone of a commanding officer. Who hired you to kill him? For the first time since she had awoken, a faint ghost of a smile touched Cassidy's cracked lips. It was a smile completely devoid of humor. Nobody hired me, Commander. I resigned from Project Echo 8 months ago. They sent hunters after me. I dealt with them. Then, I began my own hunt. Sully, who had been staring at the laptop, suddenly gasped. Jax, Commander, look at this. Jax turned to the screen. Sully was opening a hidden subfolder within the shot log. It wasn't just ballistic data. It's a ledger, Sully whispered, scrolling through thousands of pages of encrypted text, bank transfers, and black site manifests. Every time she took a shot, the rifle's black box didn't just record the kill. It unlocked an evidence file. Money laundering, illegal arms deals, human trafficking routes, all tied directly to Arthur Sterling and 16 other targets. Jax looked back at Cassidy, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She wasn't a rogue assassin out for blood. She was a whistleblower, and the Chetak M200 wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a cryptographically secure, irrefutable chain of evidence. Every confirmed, physically impossible kill authenticated the data attached to it. No intelligence agency could deny the files, because the math of the shots proved they were real. I didn't kill Arthur Sterling to silence him, Cassidy said softly, her eyes locking onto Jax's. I killed him to make him speak. And the people who funded him, they are coming to Reykjavik to silence this rifle. Before Jax could respond, the heavy steel door of the armory locked with a loud, electronic clang. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the blood-red glow of the base's emergency tactical lighting. Voss's voice screamed over Jax's radio, panicked and breathless. Commander, perimeter breach. We have multiple bogies on the north wire. They cut the hard lines. They're here. Jax drew his Sig Sauer. The time for questions was over. The ghost of the north had brought the war right to his front door. The blood-red tactical lights bathed the armory in a hellish glow. Jax didn't hesitate. A SEAL team leader didn't freeze when the plan fell apart, he simply executed the next one. He racked the slide of his Sig Sauer P226 chambering a 9mm round with a sharp, metallic clack. Sully, Jax barked over the blaring klaxons. Pull that hard drive. If they get the Chatax data logger. Everything she did was for nothing. Put it in a Faraday pouch and lock it in the Class A safe. Now. Sully scrambled, his fingers flying over the Panasonic Toughbook. Copy that, Commander. Encrypting the partition and pulling the drive. Jax turned to Dr. Evans, who was frozen against the concrete wall. Doc, stay low, behind the steel workbenches. Do not move unless I tell you to. He tapped his earpiece, switching to the encrypted tactical frequency. Voss. Holloway, sitrep, how many bogies and what's their vector? Commander, Voss's voice crackled, tight but controlled. They blew the northern service doors. Thermal cameras caught at least 12 hostiles. Black gear, suppressed HK-416 carbines. Panoramic night vision. They are moving with absolute discipline. Bounding Overwatch. This isn't a smash and grab. Jax, this is a Tier 1 hit squad. Arthur Sterling's cleaners, Jax muttered grimly. He looked at Cassidy. She was still standing perfectly still in the center of the room. Her bare feet on the freezing floor. Her oversized medical scrubs. She looked incredibly fragile, like a ghost that could be blown away by the wind. But her eyes were calculating the geometry of the room, identifying the fatal funnels and choke points. They are here for the Wraith 408, Cassidy said, her voice cutting through the noise of the alarms. And the data. If they breach this room, they will throw flashbangs, followed by thermobaric grenades to destroy the evidence. We cannot defend this box. She's right, Sully said, yanking the encrypted hard drive from the laptop and shoving it into a heavy steel wall safe. He spun the dial, locking it down. If we stay in the armory, we get cornered. Then we break out, Jax said. He moved to the weapon racks, pulling down a customized Mk18 short-barreled rifle. He tossed a plate carrier vest to Sully. Cassidy stepped forward, her hand reaching out. I need a weapon, Commander. Jax looked at her. Her heart rate was barely stabilizing. She had been dying of hypothermia an hour ago. You can barely stand, Miller. My cardiovascular system is compromised. Yes, Cassidy stated flatly. But my fine motor skills are fully integrated. Give me a weapon, or you will die in that hallway. Sully didn't wait for Jax's approval. The armorer reached into a reinforced locker and pulled out a long, heavy rifle. It wasn't the Wraith 408, that was locked onto the evidence table, but it was a beast in its own right. Mk13 Mod 7. Sully grunted, tossing the weapon to Cassidy along with a heavy steel magazine. Chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. Suppressed. It's got a Night Force ATACR optic on it. Zeroed at 200 yards. Cassidy caught the heavy sniper rifle with one hand. The moment the weapon touched her palm, her entire posture changed. The fragility vanished. She checked the chamber, seated the magazine, and slid the bolt home with a terrifying, fluid grace. She wasn't just holding the rifle, she became an extension of it. We moved to the secondary comms bunker down the east corridor. Jax ordered, taking point at the heavy steel door. Voss, Holloway, fall back and cover our six. We squeeze them in the hallway. Jax pushed the armory door open. His Mk18 raised, clearing the fatal funnel. The east corridor was dark, lit only by the strobing red emergency lights. The air smelled of cordite and burning insulation. Moving, Jax whispered. Sully followed, keeping Dr. Evans covered. Cassidy brought up the rear. Despite her bare feet, she made absolutely zero sound. It was as if she were gliding over the concrete. They reached the first intersection. Suddenly, the radio hissed. Contact. Contact front. Holloway yelled over the comms. We are pinned down in the atrium. They have a heavy gunner suppressing the corridor. A barrage of 5.56mm rounds tore through the drywall intersection just 20 feet ahead of Jax. The air filled with pulverized gypsum and concrete dust. Jax ducked back behind the corner, debris raining down on his tactical helmet. They have the angle, Jax shouted over the gunfire. If we step out, we get cut in half. Cassidy moved up right behind him. She didn't crouch, she stood tall, pressing her back against the wall, holding the heavy Mk-13 close to her chest. She closed her eyes. What are you doing? Jax demanded. Listening, she whispered. The gunner is using a localized suppression pattern, Cassidy said, her eyes snapping open. He fires a 3-second burst, sweeps left to right, then pauses for 0.8 seconds to manage recoil. We can't peek the corner, Jax said. It's suicide. You don't have to, Cassidy replied. She dropped to one knee, sliding the long barrel of the suppressed Mk-13 inches past the edge of the drywall. She didn't look through the scope. She didn't even expose her head. Cassidy, what the hell are you doing? Sully hissed. You can't see him. I don't need to see him, she said, her voice dead calm. I know where he is. Drywall is 0.5 inches thick. The steel stud is 2 inches to the left of the corner. She pressed her cheek against the stock. She exhaled a long, white plume of cold breath into the red air. Wait for the pause, she whispered. The heavy machine gun roared again, tearing the corridor to shreds. 1, 2, 3. The gunfire stopped. The 0.8-second recoil pause. Cassidy pulled the trigger. The heavy .300 Win mag round ripped straight through the corner of the drywall, punching through the structural steel stud as if it were paper. Dust exploded into the hallway. A heavy thud echoed from the other end of the corridor. The machine gun stopped completely. Jax swung out, raising his rifle. At the far end of the hall, 70 yards away, a mercenary in heavy black armor was slumped backward, a massive exit wound blown through his reinforced Kevlar helmet. She had shot him blind, through a wall, based entirely on the acoustic signature of his gunfire. Target down, Cassidy said mechanically, racking the bolt and ejecting a smoking brass casing onto the floor. Move. Jax stared at her for a split second, a cold chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic weather. He nodded. Push forward. Go, go, go. They rushed down the corridor, vaulting over the debris. Voss and Holloway linked up with them at the entrance to the secondary comms bunker, their faces covered in sweat and soot. Good timing, Commander. Voss breathed heavily, checking his magazine, but they are falling back to the motor pool. They know they lost the element of surprise. They aren't retreating, Cassidy said, stepping into the bunker and lowering the rifle. She looked at the reinforced windows that faced the icy tarmac outside. They are repositioning. They realize they cannot take the data drive in close quarters. So, they will destroy the entire structure. With what? Sully asked. A laser-designated airstrike, or a focused thermite charge. Cassidy answered. She pointed a scarred finger toward the window. Through the howling blizzard, a faint, almost invisible green laser painted the reinforced concrete wall of the bunker. They have a spotter on the ridgeline. 900 yards out, he is painting the target. Jax swore under his breath. If that laser stays painted, a missile from a ghost drone is going to turn us all into ash. I can't hit a target at 900 yards in this blizzard with a standard assault rifle, Holloway said, gritting his teeth. We can't even see the ridgeline. Cassidy stepped up to the window. She flipped the bipod down on the Mk-13 and rested it on the windowsill. She dialed the elevation turret on the Night Force scope. Click, click, click. You can't make that shot, Sully said. shaking his head. Cassidy, the wind out there is gusting at 40 miles an hour. It's a whiteout. You don't have the WRAITH 408. You don't have your black box. Cassidy looked through the scope. The crosshairs floated in a sea of swirling white snow. I am the black box. Chief Sullivan, Cassidy whispered. She adjusted her breathing. Her heart rate dropped back to that impossible, hibernating 48 beats per minute. She watched the way the snowflakes swirled against the glass. She felt the micro vibrations of the wind hitting the concrete wall. Wind is full value from 3 o'clock. Gusting at 38.5. Elevation drop is exactly 210 inches. She held her breath. The world stopped spinning. She pulled the trigger. The heavy bullet tore through the glass, disappearing into the white abyss of the storm. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of the howling wind. And then, out in the dark, the green laser abruptly vanished. Cassidy slowly pulled her eye away from the scope. She looked at Jax, her pale blue eyes completely devoid of arrogance, showing only the cold, hard truth of a mathematician who had just solved a deadly equation. Spotter neutralized, she said. The drive is safe, Commander, for now. The wind howled through the shattered reinforced glass, bringing a dusting of Arctic snow into the comms bunker. Cassidy slowly lowered the Mk-13. The heavy barrel was still smoking. She didn't check to see if the target was down. The math had already confirmed it before the bullet even struck. Her pale blue eyes lost their intense, hyper-focused edge, and for a fraction of a second, she swayed on her bare feet. Jax caught her before she hit the floor. I've got you, the commander said, his strong grip supporting her weight. She felt as light as a handful of dry leaves. The adrenaline that had spiked her heart rate was burning off, leaving the brutal reality of her hypothermia and exhaustion to take its toll. Voss, Holloway, Jax barked into his comms. The spotter is neutralized. The exterior perimeter is blind. What's the status on the assault team? They're pulling back, Commander, Voss replied, his voice echoing over the radio. They lost their overwatch, and base security is finally spinning up the QRF, Quick Reaction Force. The hostiles are falling back to the ice shelf. They're bugging out. Jax exhaled a heavy breath, lowering Cassidy onto a steel folding chair in the center of the bunker. They're not gone for good. They're just recalculating. Sully, get that drive online. We need to know exactly what kind of hell we're standing in the middle of. Sully slammed the heavy steel door of the bunker shut, locking the deadbolts. He set the Panasonic Toughbook on a metal crate and plugged the encrypted hard drive back in. His fingers flew across the keyboard. I'm bypassing the secondary firewall, Sully muttered, sweat dripping from his chin. Okay, I'm in the root directory. Commander, you need to see this. Jax stepped up behind the armorer. The screen was filled with a meticulously organized grid of folders. 17 folders in total. Each one was labeled with a date, a set of coordinates, and a target designation. Open folder number 1, Jax ordered. Sully clicked. The folder didn't just contain a shot log. It exploded with data. Offshore bank account numbers in the Cayman Islands. Classified cargo manifests from Bagram Airfield. Video files of black market weapons transfers. Emails stamped with SAP, Special Access Program, clearance. Who is the target? Jax asked, his voice tightening. General Thomas Vance. Sully read, his face going pale. 3-star. He died in a helicopter crash in the Hindu Kush 14 months ago. At least, the Pentagon said it was a crash. Sully clicked the attached ballistic file. Distance, 2,840 meters. Status, neutralized. It wasn't a crash, Cassidy whispered from the chair behind them. She had pulled a thermal blanket tightly around her shoulders. It was a catastrophic rotor failure, initiated by a .408 solid copper round to the main drive shaft from a ridgeline 2 miles away. Jax turned to face her. The tactical red lighting cast deep shadows across her face. 17 targets, Jax said, his voice dropping an octave. Generals, defense contractors, intelligence directors. For 14 months, you've been systematically executing the most powerful men in the military-industrial complex. I didn't choose them because they were powerful. Commander, Cassidy said quietly. I chose them because they built the cage. Jax pulled up a crate and sat down, placing himself at eye level with her. He rested his forearms on his knees. Who are you, Cassidy? Truly. And don't tell me you're just a ghost. Ghosts don't leave ledgers. Cassidy looked down at her scarred hands. For a long time, the only sound in the bunker was the hum of the servers. I grew up in the system, she began, her voice devoid of self-pity, delivering the facts with the same clinical precision she used for windage. Foster care, group homes. I didn't talk much, but I tested well, exceptionally well on spatial reasoning, geometry, and pattern recognition. When I was 8 years old, a man in a tailored suit came to the state facility. He said I had a gift. He said I could serve my country. Project Echo, Jax guessed. She nodded once. They didn't give us toys. They gave us anemometers to measure wind speed. We didn't learn history, we learned atmospheric physics, internal ballistics, and the Coriolis effect. By the time I was 17, I was firing at targets beyond 2,000 meters. By 21, I was fully operational. Sully, still staring at the screen, shook his head. They built you to be an asset. A weapon that couldn't be traced. We were told we were taking out terrorists. Cassidy said, her pale eyes hardening. High-value threats that conventional forces couldn't reach without starting a war. And for a while, we were. But the parameters shifted. The program evolved. The targets stopped being threats to the nation. And started being threats to the men running the program. Jax finished the thought. The sickening reality sinking in. They turned a Black Ops sniper team into a private hit squad. Arthur Sterling, Cassidy said, saying the name like it was poison. He was the architect. He and the 16 men in those files. They used Project Echo to eliminate their business rivals, to silence whistleblowers, and to cover up billion-dollar procurement frauds. What changed your mind? Jax asked softly. What made you stop pulling the trigger for them? Cassidy closed her eyes. A micro-expression of profound grief washed over her face, the first real emotion Jax had seen her display. 8 months ago, a mission in Finland, she whispered. The target was flagged as a foreign intelligence operative. I was in position. 1,500 meters. The crosshairs were on her chest. But the wind shifted. The snow cleared for just 3 seconds. She swallowed hard. She wasn't an operative. She was an academic researcher who had found irregularities in Sterling's defense contracts. And when the snow cleared, I saw them, 2 little girls, running out the front door, throwing their arms around her waist. She was a mother. Commander, a mother. Silence filled the room. Jax felt a knot form in his throat. I took my finger off the trigger, Cassidy said, opening her eyes, the cold steel returning to them. I broke radio silence. I refused the shot. And the moment I did, I became a liability. They scrubbed my identity. They deleted me from existence. They sent my own teammates to hunt me. Jax stood up, pacing the small bunker. He looked at the hard drive. So you went on the offensive. You spent 14 months hunting the men who built you. But why the ledger? Why not just leak the data to the press? Because data can be manipulated, Cassidy explained, her voice steadying. Files can be forged. Hard drives can be dismissed as Russian disinformation or deepfakes. Arthur Sterling owned the media. He owned senators. If I just leaked a USB drive, they would have buried it in a day. She pointed a trembling finger at the laptop screen. But you cannot fake the physics of a 4,000-meter kill, she said, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable conviction. The black box on the Wraith 408 records the telemetry, the GPS, the atmospheric data, and the cryptographic hash of the evidence files at the exact millisecond the firing pin strikes. The shot authenticates the data. If the shot is real, the evidence is real. It is an unbreakable, irrefutable chain of truth. Sully stared at her, his mouth slightly open. You weren't going on a killing spree. You were building a cryptographically secure court record, using sniper bullets as digital signatures. I was building accountability, Cassidy said simply, and I was taking it to the only place that Arthur Sterling couldn't buy. Jax stopped pacing. He looked at her. understanding dawning on him. The Hague, the International Criminal Court. The vessel your team found me near, it was a charter out of Tromsø. She nodded. I was supposed to meet a contact offshore. A federal prosecutor. But Sterling's men tracked me. They planted an explosive on the hull. When the boat went down in the freezing water, they assumed the Atlantic would finish the job. They didn't know they were dealing with a ghost, Jax said softly. He looked at Sully, then at the hard drive. He had spent his entire life serving the flag, following the chain of command. But the men in those files, the men who had built a little girl into a weapon and then tried to drown her, were a cancer inside the uniform he loved. Jax reached into his tactical vest and pulled out an encrypted, untraceable satellite phone. Not standard Navy issue, personal. Commander, Sully warned. If you make this call, if you step outside the chain of command to protect her, there's no going back. We become ghosts, too. Jax looked at his armorer. He thought about the men who had died in the Hindu Kush because of General Vance's greed. He thought about the mother in Finland who was still alive to hug her daughters because of the woman sitting in front of him. Chief Sullivan, Jax said, his voice hard as Icelandic bedrock. I don't wait for permission to do what's right. Jax dialed the number. The phone rang twice. Yeah, a gruff voice answered on the other end. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. Douglas, Jax said, using the first name of Douglas Haynes. A ruthless, incorruptible federal prosecutor Jax had worked with years ago. It's Reed. Are you still heading to Brussels for that NATO treaty negotiation tomorrow? I am. Why, Jax? You sound like you're in a firefight. Jax looked at Cassidy. She was watching him, her pale eyes filled with something that looked entirely foreign to her. Hope. I'm in Reykjavik, Jax said into the phone. And I have a package. A very heavy package. It contains the keys to burn down the shadow government. And it has a heartbeat. I need exfil. I need cover. And I need you to meet me at The Hague. There was a long pause on the line. Douglas Haynes was a smart man. He knew exactly what Jax was risking. Get her somewhere stable, Commander, Haynes finally said. I'll make the arrangements. Jax hung up the phone. He turned to Cassidy. The storm outside was beginning to break. The faintest hint of a gray Arctic dawn creeping through the shattered window. We leave in an hour, Jax told her. We're taking the fight to them. For the first time since they had pulled her from the bruising waters of the North Atlantic. Cassidy Miller, the ghost of Project Echo, let out a long, quiet breath. Thank you, Commander, she whispered. But as Sully prepared to encrypt the final partition of the drive, the computer screen suddenly flashed red. A hidden firewall, deeper than the first, began to execute a protocol. Wait, Sully said, his fingers freezing over the keyboard. Jax, Cassidy, there's a second partition in the module, hidden underneath the 17 targets. It's locked behind a completely different architecture. Cassidy's expression went perfectly still. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating mask of the sniper. I know, she said quietly. Jax looked at her, his combat instincts flaring up again. Cassidy, what's in the second partition? She stood up, pulling the thermal blanket tight. She looked out at the gray dawn. I told you the shot that killed Arthur Sterling was 4,112 meters, she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. In the logs that you just saw, it isn't the longest shot. Jax felt the air leave the room. Not even close, Cassidy added. The bunker was dead quiet. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Sully's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The Panasonic Toughbook screen had gone entirely black, except for a single, blinking white cursor in the center. The second partition, the phantom drive hidden deep inside the Wraith 408's black box, was fighting back with military-grade encryption. Cassidy, Jax said, his voice a low, steady rumble. What exactly did you build into this rifle? I didn't just build a weapon, Commander, she replied, her pale eyes fixed on the screen. I built a time machine. Sully hit the enter key. The screen exploded into a cascade of scrolling green text. It wasn't just 17 folders anymore. It was hundreds, Thousands of files, cross-referenced, timestamped, and verified with ballistic telemetry. Good God, Sully whispered, his face glowing in the emerald light of the monitor. Jax, this isn't just the 14 months she was rogue. This is everything. This is the entire operational history of Project Echo. Dating back 12 years, every wet work contract, every black bag job, every illegal wiretap and assassination ordered by the Shadow Network. Jax felt the floor drop out from under him. The sheer scale of the data was incomprehensible. It was enough to dismantle half the intelligence apparatus in Washington and send hundreds of powerful men to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. You said you've been doing this for 14 months. Jax looked at Cassidy. I have been hunting them for 14 months. She corrected him, her voice terrifyingly calm. I have been recording them for 7 years. I knew what they were doing long before I refused that shot in Finland. I just needed to ensure the cage I was building for them was inescapable. Jax stared at her. The patience, the absolute, sociopathic level of discipline required to play the obedient soldier for years. Pulling the trigger on command. All while secretly archiving every drop of blood to use as evidence. She wasn't just a sniper. She was the ultimate apex predator of the intelligence world. The longest shot, Jax reminded her, his mind racing back to her previous statement. You said 4,112 meters wasn't the longest. It isn't, Sully interrupted, his voice trembling. He clicked on a file at the very bottom of the directory. It was encrypted with a unique black and red icon. Commander, look at the date on this telemetry log. Jax leaned in. The date was tomorrow. Tomorrow? Jax frowned. Sully, the system clock must be glitched. It's not glitched, Cassidy said, stepping away from the window and walking toward the table. The Wraith 408 doesn't just record the past. It calculates trajectories, physical trajectories, and political ones. At 4,000 meters, a bullet takes 7.4 seconds to reach its target. Cassidy explained, her voice echoing in the small concrete bunker. But there are other kinds of bullets. Commander, I transmitted a compressed micro-burst of this partition to Douglas Haynes's secure server in Brussels 3 hours ago. The decryption key activates tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. Eastern Standard Time. Jax's eyes widened as he finally understood the sheer genius of her plan. Tomorrow morning, Cassidy continued, her voice cold and unyielding. When Arthur Sterling's associates walk into the Pentagon, Wall Street, and Capitol Hill, that data will simultaneously hit the servers of the Department of Justice, Interpol, and the International Criminal Court. The evidence is irrefutable. The ballistic signatures are locked. She looked at the black box embedded in her rifle. That is my longest shot. Commander Reed, she whispered, a bullet of pure data. Fired from the middle of the freezing Atlantic Ocean. Traveling across the world. Its flight time is exactly 24 hours. And when it hits, it will shatter their entire empire. The bunker shook as heavy rotors descended over the Reykjavik base. Voss's voice crackled over the radio, filled with immense relief. Commander, Base QRF is on site. The cavalry is here. I repeat, we have 3 platoons of Marines securing the perimeter. The hostiles have completely broken contact. They're gone. Jax exhaled, a long, ragged breath. He looked at the woman standing before him. She had taken on a global syndicate of billionaires and rogue generals with nothing but a custom rifle and an intellect sharper than a diamond scalpel. And she had won. Pack up the drive, Sully, Jax ordered. We're going to the airfield. The Arctic sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a blinding, golden light across the icefields of Iceland. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked washed clean. On the frozen tarmac, a massive U.S. Air Force C-17 Globemaster III sat idling. Its rear cargo ramp lowered. Heavily armed Marines stood guard in a wide perimeter, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Commander Jackson Reed walked beside Cassidy Miller. She was no longer wearing the oversized medical scrubs. Sully had found her a black tactical fleece, combat pants, and boots. Over her shoulder, slung effortlessly by a heavy canvas strap, was the WRAITH 408. She walked with the steady, measured cadence of a soldier. The hypothermia that had nearly killed her just 12 hours ago seemed like a distant memory. Her body had done what it was trained to do, survive the impossible. Then returned to baseline. They reached the base of the cargo ramp. Douglas Haynes's trusted federal agents were waiting inside the aircraft to escort her to The Hague. Cassidy stopped and turned to Jax. "You risked your career today, Commander," she said. Her voice was still flat, but there was a profound, unspoken gratitude beneath the surface. "You stepped outside the wire for a ghost." "I didn't do it for a ghost," Jax replied, looking her dead in the eye. "I did it for the mother in Finland. I did it because sometimes the chain of command gets rusted, and somebody has to break it." Jax reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out a heavy, bronze Navy SEAL Challenge coin, the emblem of his specific Trident team. He pressed it into Cassidy's scarred palm. "If you ever need an exfil," Jax said quietly, "you show that to anyone wearing a Trident. They'll bring you home." Cassidy looked down at the heavy bronze coin. Her fingers closed over it, holding it tight. For a woman who had spent her entire life being used by men in power, this small token of absolute, unconditional loyalty was heavier than the rifle on her back. "Thank you, Jax," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. She unslung the massive Chetak M200 from her shoulder and held it out to him. "Take it," she said. Jax looked at the weapon. "You're giving up the Wraith?" "Its job is done," Cassidy said, a faint, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "The evidence is in the hands of the law now. And where I'm going, I won't need a 4,000-meter rifle. Keep it safe, Commander, until the world needs it again." Jax took the heavy weapon. It felt like holding a piece of history. Cassidy turned and walked up the ramp of the C-17. She didn't look back, as the heavy hydraulic doors began to close, sealing her inside the cavernous belly of the aircraft. The golden morning light caught her face one last time. Her pale blue eyes were clear. The war was over. Jax stood on the icy tarmac, watching the Globemaster climb into the endless blue sky, disappearing into the clouds. He slung the Wraith 408 over his shoulder, feeling the cold weight of the black box pressing against his back. He keyed his radio. "Voss, Holloway, Sully," Jax said, his voice carrying the quiet pride of a man who knew he had just fought the good fight. "Pack your gear, let's go home." Somewhere out there, the longest shot in history was still flying through the digital ether. And tomorrow morning, when it finally hit its mark, the world would never be the same again. But for today, the ghost of the North could finally rest.